Do you like Das Boat, but wish it were more British and not set underwater? The Cruel Sea may be the perfect movie for you. In all seriousness, it's time to sound the hidden gem alarm, because this is a great movie. It's not totally unknown, but I'd never heard of it. I don't really even remember how I found out about it, but I'm glad I did, because this movie is really up my alley, and I'm excited to share it with you. The Cruel Sea is a British film from 1953. It was made by Ealing Studios, who put out a number of classic post-war films. They mainly did comedies, such as the somewhat ludicrous Alec Guinness film Kind Hearts and Coronets, or the Alexander McKendrick film The Ladykillers. The Cruel Sea doesn't really sound like it would be a comedy, and it isn't one. This is a war film that follows a ship in the Royal Navy as it tries to hunt down some U-boats. It's directed by Charles Friend, who I don't really know anything about. It's got Jack Hawkins in the lead. I'm not an expert in this era of British film, to be honest. I didn't recognize many of the actors here, with the exception of Denholm Elliott, who is in Indiana Jones, and Virginia McKenna, who is in Born Free. Overall, the cast and the acting is good in this movie. Apparently, Dirk Bogarde wanted to be in the film, but was turned away because his accent wasn't posh enough. This movie mainly follows naval officers. There are sailors in it, but they really aren't the focus. Typically, I'm not as interested in movies that have a big aristocratic tilt to them. You know me. I'm a man of the people. I didn't really like The League of Gentlemen, for instance, one of Jack Hawkins' most famous films, I guess. I prefer something more like The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. Nonetheless, this movie works for me. It has some potent ideas about sacrifice, camaraderie, friendship, that transcend snootiness, that pierce through the snootiness. Although there are a couple moments here and there where things maybe get bogged down in ceremony. Maybe it's intentional. There is quite a contrast between social artifice and war. The movie takes a little bit of time to build emotional intensity and to really bring us into the characters. This movie takes some time to get going, honestly. It feels a little bit more like a documentary or a newsreel at first. Believe me, though, you'll feel for these guys by the time the movie comes to a close. Besides the cast of actors, the movie also has a huge cast of ships. This movie came out in 1953, so there were plenty of military remnants floating around in various ports and in people's minds. This movie has great production values. We get the opening credits over a shot of the sea, the Cruel Sea, to be specific, and the waves look really big. It's hard to film waves and make them look big. And it's also hard to film a movie at sea. They did a great job. Obviously, everybody got wet while making this movie. Everybody got wet. A lot of scenes, I think, could have only been filmed with the real thing on hand, with the real ship, the actors actually out on it. There's also some newsreel footage. Some of it sticks out somewhat conspicuously. Some of it blends in a little better. There are also scenes filmed on sound stages. There is some rear projection that looks a bit two-dimensional, looks a bit phony. There are also some models, and some of them look a bit like models. They look a little small. But I've always thought that the best way to get good special effects, especially back in the day, is to mix together a whole bunch of different techniques. And even if some of them are a bit transparent, overall, you can get something that's much harder to unravel, something that's much harder to put your finger on and to sort of understand. Some of the special effects in this film do look really great on their own. The depth charges that go off when they try to sink the subs look enormous. You see them exploding off the bow of the ship, and I'm not sure if that was stock footage taken from somewhere else, or footage from the war, if they really did that, but it's extremely convincing. There's a scene where someone swims alongside the bow of the ship as it cruises, almost gets run over, and it looks like this person actually did it, which would be a tough sell for the insurance company these days. Overall, this is a salty movie, and frankly, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who doesn't know how to swim. I would strongly recommend everyone who watches The Cruel Sea to wear a life preserver, just to avoid any risk of drowning. Even though we have some big moments in this movie, I wouldn't say that it's all about spectacle. In fact, I think the movie occupies a very interesting spot in the history of sort of war films. During World War II, Ealing Studios made a number of war films. Most films made during the war have an inevitable patriotic sort of side to them. Although there's some interesting exceptions, such as So Proudly We Hail, which I reviewed on this channel a while ago, or the Archer's film, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, or the Lubitsch classic, To Be or Not to Be. Those last two were made a bit earlier in the war, perhaps before the full extent of the damage was understood. For the most part, films made during the war are a bit propagandist. Even if it's, on our side, they're a bit patriotic. After the war, it wouldn't be too long before we start to see a lot of war films that are really focused on spectacle. Think about The Longest Day, the longest movie, The Longest Day. Making that movie was almost like going to war. The formula of the war spectacle makes a lot of sense for Hollywood. Hollywood likes spectacles, and these movies can usually sidestep some tricky political questions and just focus on heroism and sort of a general sense of tragedy and how big everything was. To be fair, The Longest Day is not a totally unsophisticated film. It has an international cast that creates some sense of documentary impartiality and historicism, a twinge of sort of a literary nature to it in some ways. So some of these films can have some highbrow appeal as well. And you can also throw in a romance and really check off all of the Hollywood boxes. There are also plenty of political war movies, many arising as proxies for contemporary conflicts such as the Vietnam War. Anyway, don't let me waste too much time talking about this, because the point is that The Cruel Sea isn't any of these things, really. In 1953, I think a lot of people were probably still struggling to understand what had happened, or to recover even. The war machine was turned off. The propaganda machine was turned off, and the people who'd been operating it were tired. Every single person involved in making this movie, every one of them, would have lived through World War II. And they all would have carried something from it into this movie, I guess. So, yeah, this is not a very patriotic war movie, which is refreshing. It was probably also too early to blow up everything as this big silver screen spectacle. So we don't get that. That's also kind of refreshing. And I guess you might say it's an anti-war film, but it's not a very political film. This movie, in some ways, doesn't seem to have much of an agenda at all. In fact, the beginning of the movie almost feels a little flat. It's not clear where we're going or what the movie is going to tell us. It's not clear what the point is. Like I said, it's a little bit distant and documentarian at first. When you strip away all of these agendas, I guess you lose a few waypoints that you might be used to seeing. But what you're left with is sobriety. And if you know me, you know there's nothing I like more than sobriety. Of course, when you strip away all these agendas, another thing you're left with is uncertainty. And if you know me, you know there's nothing I like more than uncertainty. Well, maybe one thing. Mature film. Now, before I sell this movie as this completely serious and grueling thing, I should point out that it actually has a lot of different episodes, a lot of different pieces. It even has a romantic subplot, more than one, actually. I've already said that the shape of the movie is a little unorthodox, starting a bit as a documentary, starting a bit slow. Some of the episodes are longer than others. You can really tell, by the way, that this movie was adapted from a book that was much, much longer than the movie. And I think overall they do a good job. But at first I was a little confused as to which characters were going to be important. One of the earlier plots, one of the earlier antagonists just sort of disappears from the movie. It's an early episode that sort of comes and goes. I was a little confused in the beginning just who everyone was as well. Some of the characters look kind of similar, and as we branch out into more episodes, sometimes it's not clear who exactly matters, or you're introduced to a new character and then they drift away quickly. I think they do a pretty good job of having, by the time the movie kind of gets going and you really get into it, you see it sort of becomes clear which storylines matter most, which ones are the long-running ones, which characters are the ones you need to actually keep track of and remember who they are, and which ones just sort of flit in and out. But there are a few moments here where you think, oh, weird, that guy is gone now, I guess, or that's the end of that story, or, why are we starting this new thing? One thing that was a little surprising about the movie is that it actually spends a fair amount of time on land, and yet it's not called The Cruel Land. in a lot of naval films, or even other types of war movies, part of the story is that the people are in it for the long haul. They are stuck at the end of the world. Think about Das Boat or Catch-22. I guess they do go on leave in Catch-22, but they don't go home. Home is this distant, unattainable thing. In The Cruel Sea, they go home a number of times. At first, I was sort of confused by this, because I had expected the film to have a big departure scene and then not to see land again until the end, I guess. But it's only 10 or 20 minutes after they leave port for the first time that they're back in port for the refit. And I thought, wait a minute, is the movie over? That was short. It turns out that these stories on land are actually a huge part of the movie, and the contrast between life on land and life at sea is a big part of the movie, and this contrast really develops as the film goes on. It's a great part of the movie. In the first half, the stories on land, they aren't too dramatic, but they really heat up. You might think that you can see where some of the subplots are going to go, the romances, for instance. You might think you see where they're going to end, but they are fresher than I had expected, and they pack more of an emotional punch than I had expected, especially given the somewhat sort of distance of some of these aristocrats in the beginning. These plots end up being a lot more sincere than I had expected. This is a good movie, honestly. It's a good movie. What more can I say? Of course, this is also an action movie, and that's, in some ways, the biggest part of it. It's also, a very suspenseful movie. That is one of the main impressions you might get from it. I've mentioned Das Boat a few times. That's one of the most suspenseful movies out there, probably. And this film uses a number of the same techniques. It's kind of the same story from the top down, from the other side, with the ships hunting down U-boats. We constantly hear the ping of the radar, just like in Das Boat. Sound design is a big part of it. Das Boat takes things a little bit farther, but this movie, similar technique. We get an interesting look at some cool technology, at some of the naval stuff. It doesn't overpower the film, but it's kind of cool. We also get some psychological elements, but they don't overdo it. We see people sort of trying to cope with the constant danger of the subs under the water. There's also a scene of everybody trying to be as quiet as possible, much like in Das Boat. Paranoia strikes deep in this film, you might say. There's a real psychological element to it. This movie is not particularly graphic, but there are a few scenes where they very conspicuously cut away from things. For the most part, I guess, they figure out how to make an intense movie without relying on gore. It's only kind of a noticeable cutaway a few times. For the most part, they really make a pretty darn intense movie without it being too graphic. Das Boat is a more intense movie than this one, but this will definitely keep you engaged. And for 1953, it's pretty darn good. One of the most engaging movies of the time, at least once you get to some of the to the business end of the film. The movie does jump around a bit, going from action to romance to something more tragic and philosophical. And I think it does feel a little bit wonky, but it works. And there may be an intentional piece here about how dislocating war is. This movie doesn't throw too many morals in your face, but it has some real insights about what it is like to fight, the psychological rigors of continuous peril, the way that being in a war changes you. As the film goes on, the suspense is turned up, the interpersonal stories are dialed up, the drama on land is dialed up, the philosophical uncertainties are magnified. Everything picks up. The movie really has two different climaxes. Again, it comes from quite a big novel, and the two climaxes have different tones. It's kind of interesting. The end of the movie itself is somewhat abrupt. This film is about 2 hours, and I gladly would have watched another hour at least. There's a lot of life in this movie, and even though it's a long time ago, in an ocean far, far away, there's real people going through these things. It sounds kind of trite, but you know that this kind of psychological realism is sort of one of my main interests in film, and this movie certainly falls into that category, sidesteps some of the classic mechanics, sidesteps some of the, flag waving that you might usually find in these movies, and gives us something, I think, a lot more valuable. In some ways, this abrupt ending is maybe fitting and caps off a lot of uncertain stories. Not very decisively, but kind of in the way that they are capped off in wartime. So that's The Cruel Sea, and yeah, this is really one of the better movies that I've reviewed recently. A big surprise for me. I guess, yeah, slightly uncommon in some ways as a war movie, and maybe the balance won't work for everyone, the balance between the action and some of the more mature stuff. But for me, I thought it really carried out all of the elements about as well as you could hope for. So just check it out.